G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy for Just the Tips. This week is huge. The final fortnight of this season is enormous, and while there hasn't been amazing games this year, there's been a lot of blowouts in games that are meant to be, hotly contested. There's still been interesting narratives, but we haven't had a whole lot of close, thrilling games. I have a feeling that's about to change in the last couple of weeks this year with so much at stake. We're essentially, aside from all the dead rubber games, of which there are a bunch, obviously, there's a bunch of games where it's basically like the finals have arrived already with so little room for error for basically all the 9 teams in the top 9, with Adelaide at the top there in the safest position. Naturally, they're still competing for a top spot, right? So once again, last week threw up some slightly surprising results. I got 7 out of 9 correct tips. The 2 I got wrong were, I tipped Collingwood to beat Hawthorn. I feel really stupid about that. Maybe it's because I watched that game and obviously they kind of got pulled apart by Hawthorn, but I felt really stupid for tipping that one. And then Brisbane losing to Sydney, I think many people would have got wrong, presumably. But the rest of the round went to plan, although West Coast nearly pulled off probably the greatest upset of all time had they won that. So we will get into round 23, but before I do that, I will get into who did well in our various competitions. So in our footy tipping competition, the weekly winner was someone called Jerry Rich with 9 correct tips, and the margin of 51 being the best margin of anyone who got 9 correct tips, if I'm reading that correctly anyway. The tipping leader is once again Connor D26, with 145 correct tips with 1 round to go and a margin of 489. And the fantasy leader is now back to Jaden Griffin. It is tied at the top there in that competition. Jaden led all year and then lost top spot last week. He's now reclaimed it, so well done, Jaden Griffin. Just a heads up, guys, we will be live once again on Saturday night. At this stage, it'll be Adelaide versus Collingwood for our weekly live show. As far as I'm aware, Druzy will be a part of that. He hasn't told me he isn't. He'll be back from Europe tomorrow, so he will rejoin all the action, and I hope you're there this weekend too for a big game between Adelaide and Collingwood. But let's get into round 23. So a big round starts off with a bit of a dead rubber. That doesn't mean there isn't some degree of intrigue, but I think it has to be said, particularly for Essendon, the season's more or less done and they're kind of limping over the line. However, having said that, the last couple of weeks, I think they've put up a pretty good fight. And most recently against the Cats at GMHBA, not many people, people were talking about Jeremy Cameron kicking 10 to 15 goals. And, to keep that margin to 44 is not a bad effort from Essendon. And their previous week, I think it was Sydney the week before, wasn't it? So there is a possibility here maybe Essendon can drag St Kilda into a bit of a dogfight here, because St Kilda were dragged into a dogfight with Richmond. They had to come from behind to win last week. I think the Saints probably more so out of these two teams have something to play for in terms of, I suppose, selling a bit of belief to the fans and trying to establish as high a ladder position as they can. There's been a lot of talk recently about all their players leaving. I don't know how true that is, but nonetheless, I still think the players will be focused on this particular game. That doesn't mean Essendon can't make a game of this, but honestly, I'd be pretty damn surprised if Essendon won it. I'm going to say St Kilda should win this by 25 points. But I tell you what, watching Isaiah, I'm thinking about the Brownlow medal. There's a chance here if St Kilda presumably win this game, he gets another 3 votes. Expect him to be a massive bolter in the Brownlow in the second half of the count, I reckon. Now we have Fremantle versus Brisbane. This is enormous. This really is like finals before the finals, because with Brisbane losing last week, the margin for error for both of these sides now is quite narrow, right? So Fremantle have won a bunch of games in a row. I think they've only lost 1 game since round 10. With some really good wins in there, some perhaps unconvincing wins against lower ranked teams, but when they've really been challenged by the top teams, they've come over the top. And I think, as I said, they've won the most games since round 10 this year. This is a big test for them with the Brisbane Lions. But funnily enough, even though they've won all their recent games, really, except for the Sydney game, Fremantle are now in the position, if they don't win at least one of these last 2 games, which are tough, they can miss the finals, which is bizarre. And that also applies here to the Brisbane Lions, because not only is this a tough game against Freo in Perth, they then have the Hawthorn Footy Club at the Gabba next week. So coming off a loss, they came hard late. Both of these teams had really close games. Fremantle obviously beat Port Adelaide. Brisbane couldn't quite get the job done against the Sydney Swans. This is shaping up to be one of the tougher games to tip. In fact, I think this might be the toughest game to tip of the round. It's probably my early nomination for game of the round, because Fremantle are hard to beat in Perth. I mean, Brisbane seem to travel well to Perth, or in general this year, I think their travel record is okay, but Fremantle are full of belief. I do pretty strongly believe Brisbane are the better side, but I have tipped against Fremantle a decent amount. I would have tipped them against GWS, Gold Coast, and Collingwood. and they won all of those games. So there is every chance Fremantle win this game. And while I think Brisbane are the better side, I am being a little bit seduced by the home factor here and perhaps the drama of Nat Fyfe retiring this week, making an impassioned speech about how he wants them to win the cup. I don't know. I got a feeling Fremantle win this game now. I have changed my mind. So if you watched a recent video on the True Footy channel, I did say that I thought Brisbane would win this game, but now I'm buying into the emotional swirl here. I think Fremantle could win this game by 7 points, which would have a massive impact on the Brisbane Lions season. Gold Coast versus GWS, the two expansion sides, obviously both. Well, Gold Coast are probably more safe in terms of making the finals, of course, but also top two is also viable for them. I think if Geelong lose a game, then Gold Coast with an extra game in hand can still make top two. I think they're relatively safe for playing finals, though, if I'm not mistaken. The Suns got the job done at Marvel Stadium last week, and GWS were far too classy for North Melbourne. So not too much to read into from either of those games, really. They have met earlier this year, and the Giants came from behind and won at NG Stadium, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think that was Canberra. That would have been NG Stadium off the top of my head. Regardless, this is now at Metricon, and I think the Gold Coast Suns are a better side. And this is crazy. I might sound silly if they go ahead and lose this game, but I'm starting to think we have completely overlooked the possibility that Gold Coast, if they finish second, could they play in a grand final this year? I think that's absolutely possible at this current point in time, and it's not from a talent point of view that would see them fail, maybe an experience point of view. So that is where GWS have them, but I'm going to tip the Suns at home here. I think they will be too hard to beat at their home ground, and they'll win this game by 21 points. Carlton versus Port Adelaide is a very dead rubber, to be honest. Two teams that have fallen way short of their expectations. Both played finals last year, Port Adelaide in a prelim, and neither have been really in the finals race for some time. Carlton, as I said, most recently losing to the Suns at Marvel Stadium. Port Adelaide going down in a thriller to Fremantle in a game where they certainly could have won that game. They are a tricky opposition for Fremantle, so I'm not too sure how much to read into that as far as form line goes, and we know they're missing a few players. I think both clubs are, to be fair. Who is the better team here? We don't need to really get into the weeds of this game because I don't think it's going to have a big impact, but who's the better team here? I think it's quite clearly Port Adelaide. Last year, these two sides played twice, and the away team won in both instances. And I think Port Adelaide should win this game, to be honest. I'll be surprised if they don't, so I will say Port Adelaide win this by 20 points. Let's go 21. Hawthorn versus the Melbourne Footy Club. Hawthorn's last couple of weeks have been really compelling for me. There was a loss to Adelaide and a big win over Collingwood. I think they're actually playing some of the more impressive footy that I've seen them play this entire season. I think they've raised the bar, and even though one of them was a loss, I think their ability to hurt teams and their speed off half-back has once again become a problem for opposition sides. So this is a bad time to get Hawthorn from that point of view, albeit this is probably on paper still a one-sided contest. The D's, however, well, I mean, the last two games, okay, they beat West Coast, that doesn't really count for much. But against the Bulldogs, perhaps it was the new coach bounce. They were quite impressive in that game and nearly decided the finals race with a couple of weeks to go had they won that game. I think it would be foolish to discount any possibility of an upset here. I've been watching footy too long to completely discount that. But if we're just going to go off logic for this game, it's hard to imagine Hawthorn don't win this game. I think they've really clicked into a groove here. And Melbourne don't have a lot to play for, albeit sometimes we do see with a new coach that can reinvigorate players, perhaps players playing for contracts, etc. Who knows? But I think Hawthorn is the only viable tip here, and I'll say that they should win this game by 33 points. Now we've reached our feature game this week on Footy from the Flat on the live show, so make sure you are tuning in if you want to be a part of it. Adelaide versus Collingwood. This looked like a grand final preview a few weeks ago, and it looked like it was going to be first versus second, and now it's more like Collingwood is in the position to have to win this game to make the top four. I think that's absolutely certain, and it is still possible that they can miss the finals, which is absurd. And if they do lose this, that's 5 out of 6 of their most recent games that they would have lost. That doesn't mean I'm ruling them out. I'm absolutely not. I think that they have been, pretty lackluster for a period of time there and dropped way more premiership points than, is really acceptable, I suppose. I think in 23 when they won the flag, they did lose 3 on the bounce, but 4 out of their last 5 is a little bit worse, and now the competition's so even, it could have a serious effect. But they're a good enough side who can come to Adelaide, a ground where they play well against a team they generally beat, particularly in close games. But I think they've beaten them earlier this year at the MCG. I'm not discounting them. Adelaide had a pretty big scare against West Coast. In fairness to Adelaide, that West Coast that played was not at all similar to the West Coast that has played every other team except St Kilda this year. So I don't really hold that too much against Adelaide. They certainly weren't at their best, but perhaps that game serves as a bit of a reality check where they don't lose the game, but they probably got a little bit of a fright in a game where the opposition was paying $15 odds to win. So having said all that, Collingwood has more dire consequences of losing this game, and I think that will motivate them. I think. And they could win, but I think you'd be very brave to tip it. There is more chance of Adelaide winning this game by 10 goals than there is of Collingwood winning by 10 goals. Maybe that's redundant to say, but I think that's definitely true. I'm not going to say it's 10 goals. I'm going to say Collingwood. See, the thing is, if it's close, then I am actually inclined to think Collingwood. I will say Adelaide get a bit of a jump on them and go 29 points. And if it's close, then I actually think Collingwood probably manage the game and win, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Now we have North Melbourne versus the Richmond Footy Club down in Tasmania. Yeah, this is actually kind of an interesting one. I think out of the two teams, North Melbourne have more to play for from a point of view of trying to, as I said, sort of said with St Kilda, I think, the amount of wins they get and how far up the ladder they finish, I think that's important to at least as supporters and probably the playing group as well. So from that point of view, they still have more to prove this year. I think they'll be disappointed with sitting second last again to West Coast, which I think is the fourth year in a row that's happened. Oh, with the exception of last year with Richmond's injury crisis. Richmond, on the other hand, I think have been playing better footy. Last week, they nearly pipped St Kilda at the MCG. It wasn't the highest caliber game of footy, to be honest, but I suppose North Melbourne also sort of pushed St Kilda the week before. I do think Richmond's form lately has slightly edged North Melbourne, but essentially this game should decide who finishes bottom two with West Coast this year. I think I'm going to err on the side of North Melbourne because of the Tasmania factor, purely because they play more games there. Albeit, I don't know how positive their record there really is, but I would have imagined they've played a fair bit more footy there than Richmond. So I'm a little bit torn, but I think I'm going to go North Melbourne this week. I'm going to say North Melbourne win this game by 1 point. Sydney versus the Cats. I feel like the Cats might even be one of these teams that people have sort of slept on again. Like it's become more popular to talk about Collingwood, Brisbane and the Adelaide Crows, and Geelong have just sort of been cruising and might cruise their way to a top two. Maybe that's just the media that I'm consuming. I just haven't seen it. But there's very much a very strong chance, I think, to finish top two and genuinely play in a grand final. With the way the other contenders have slipped this year, this is also still a big game for them because I think if they win, top two becomes very likely. And if they lose it, then I think they can still make the top four. So they're still in a pretty good position. I don't think it's realistic that they miss the finals. But, they'd still rather finish top two. So there's something at play here. Sydney have become a bit of an annoying team to play against, with all due respect. I meant it in a positive way. Obviously, last week, pipping the Brisbane Lions, the only team to beat Fremantle in the last 13 games or something like that. There has been an improvement in their form. And they're also not a team that I think needs finals on the agenda to play well. I feel like they run seasons out fairly well from what I can remember, so I don't think there's too much of a chance they check out, if that makes sense. All that to say, I think this could be a really good game, and generally when these two sides have met over the last number of years, albeit Sydney's been playing in grand finals, I suppose so has Geelong, but Sydney have been winning the games in Sydney, but there is a bigger gap in talent between these two sides this year. I'm rambling. I think this is going to be an upset this week. I think Geelong could win this game, but I'm very impressed with Sydney at the moment, obviously winning at the Gabba last week. Can they do it 2 weeks in a row? I think they can. I'm going to tip the Swans to win this by 5 points, and that will throw some chaos and will really help out Gold Coast if they're still pushing for top two. And I think the final game of the round, if I'm not mistaken, is the Western Bulldogs and the West Coast Eagles at Marvel Stadium. This isn't looking like the bloodbath that perhaps it looked 7 days ago when, before West Coast played well against Adelaide, which no one, including myself, saw coming. And equally, the Bulldogs were pushed right to the end by the Melbourne Footy Club. I do recall 2 years ago when West Coast, I think we'd just lost the Derby by 101 points. The Eagles upset the Bulldogs in what was, I think still to this day, the biggest upset by betting odds the game has ever seen. If I'm not mistaken, it was West Coast were paying $13. It's the biggest upset this game has ever seen. And the relevance there is that it actually knocked the Bulldogs out of the finals race, and they missed finals in 2023, if I'm remembering that correctly. So there's a correlation there, but I don't think West Coast do this 2 weeks in a row, and I'd imagine the Bulldogs don't let this happen again. I think this has Well, you're talking about, the worst team in the competition against one of the more potent teams in the competition. So if West Coast isn't absolutely at full throttle, this is a belting. So I'm going to say that the Bulldogs win by 60 points. I'm not fooled or seduced by West Coast playing really well against Adelaide, but I will be impressed if they do it 2 weeks in a row. Let's go the Bulldogs by 62. And that's the end of the round. Let's have a look at the ladder. I haven't been watching. Oh my God, Fremantle wins second. Okay, that is something I overlooked in this video. I knew they could still finish third, but I didn't think they were likely to finish second. So that is enormous. That is insane. And for the record, if Fremantle were to hypothetically lose their last 2 games and finish 9th with 15 wins, that is more wins than Brisbane had last year when they won the flag, which is absolutely absurd. Adelaide and Fremantle in the top 2 is crazy. Geelong in 3rd and the Gold Coast Suns in 4th with a game to play, albeit maybe that's what I'm missing here. Fremantle have a game more than Gold Coast, then maybe that actually will cost them depending on how Gold Coast go, which of course is not locked in. Hawthorn in 5th, Collingwood slipping down to 6th, the Brisbane Lions in 7th. That's a big game next week, Brisbane versus Hawthorn. The Bulldogs in 8th, and now GWS in 9th. I feel somewhat confident about the Giants losing to the Gold Coast Suns this week, but there's so many 50-50 games, and the mindset and mentality of how these clubs come out in this last fortnight will ultimately decide it more so than the actual skill differences between them. Is the rest of the ladder worth looking through? Not really. We still have Essendon in 15th and Carlton. Carlton in 14th might be new, and then North Melbourne obviously moving up from second last to third last. So it's going to be a really interesting last couple of weeks. As I said, join us for the live show this week. Let us know in the comments your tips, your game of the round. I think my upset of the round would probably be the Swans over Geelong. Is that enough of an upset? It probably is. There's some real 50-50s in there. I'm not sure about North and Richmond. And game of the round, let's go Fremantle over the Brisbane Lions in a thriller. But I'm pretty torn about that game too. I still think Brisbane's better, but I just have a feeling Fremantle win, if that makes sense. Let me know in the comments what you think, guys. I'll see you next week. Cheers.